where this does get productive is when it comes to identifying and managing the risks that are most likely to come to pass and being able to quantitatively account for the things that you can't foresee. Like, everybody sees the utility in building a risk register. Everybody sees the utility in understanding what the inherent risk is at a project level. And so what this methodology is offering in the next layer of detail is these are the things that are most likely to specifically go wrong, and the large magnitude risks that others have foreseen or that others have not foreseen but experienced. And then what do we do to plan for these things? What do we do to work on these things? And that is where innovation starts to dovetail into this work. It's how do we do things differently in a way to either reduce the risk that we're seeing or increase the potential upside and opportunity by doing something in a different way.
This chat with Andrew Gillis was heaps of fun. We talk about innovation, which everybody knows is one of my favorite topics. Andrew's got a PhD. He works as a consultant with Red Team projects in Canada, and he's got so much to say about how projects fail and about innovation in the industry. Right? Do we have enough innovation? How does it work? How do boards make decisions about innovation? What are the solutions? How do we improve as an industry? Really interesting discussion. Hope you get something out of it. Let's get into it. Andrew, welcome to the show, man.
Great to be here, René. Really happy to be speaking with you.
Thanks for making this time work. It's early in the morning for us. You're in Canada. So yeah, really excited to speak to you. But I've got no idea who you are. So that might be a great place to start because, that sounds very brutal, but I only just wheeled into you on the internet. It's like, man, this guy's got some really interesting ideas. And I've been reading some of your stuff online.
Sure.
And that really got us to chat and say, hey, can we have a conversation? Because I think you're well and truly into mining innovation, whatever that means, right? And there's a lot of talk on this side of the world about the lack of innovation, and I've talked on this channel a fair bit about innovation. And I don't think it's a fair representation of what a lot of people are doing. And there's a lot of innovation, I think, but. So from that angle, I thought it'd be great to catch up with you and see what you do, because, Red Team, never heard of it. I'd love to hear what Red Team does. And, you're a consultant, I guess. So maybe as a first question, what do you do and what's your background and what's your sort of touch point with the industry?
I did a mining engineering degree at the University of British Columbia.
Right.
Did engineering because all of my high school teachers told me I'd be an engineer. So why swim against the current there? So I decided to do that and then pursued mining. The way that the University of British Columbia works is you do a general first year of engineering and then you specialize after that. And I realized I didn't want to be stuck behind a desk or a computer for the rest of my life. So I figured, something in the mineral sector, civil sector could be really interesting. And mining seemed to provide the broadest range of potential opportunities when it came to, international work, variety of work, interesting, exciting things. So I decided to pursue that, loved it, continued to love it, left school, joined somebody in a company in Canada in the met sector, Canada's largest supplier of mineral separation equipment. And had a great time, traveled the world. Lots of different commodities, lots of different areas, lots of different technologies. I think that's where I started to get bitten, I guess, by the innovation bug. There was a lot of really interesting work going on, everything from early stage research to technology development, application in the field. And it really excited me. I love doing new things, love solving really hard problems.
Right.
So really grew into that. Then for a change, spent a couple of years in operations. From a personal point of view, I'd gotten married, and being out of the country for 150 or 160 days a year wasn't working out so well. As it did in my early and mid 20s. So went into operations for a couple of years, and there worked in improvement projects for a really large mining operator in Canada. They move about 1 million tons a day. So a lot of room for improvement on the process side, working on, projects across the business there.
Yeah.
But then went back into the Met sector with a much stronger focus on innovation. I was in charge of IP, R&D, commercialization and new technology, as well as sales and marketing and some touch points in major projects. So really got to work on some really cutting edge technology development, project related to the application of microwave energy for rock breakage, for example, working on a new comminution device, on some gold recovery technology. So a few different areas in there. Coming out of that, well, I should mention during this time period, I did an MBA. So got, more and more, as I advanced in my career, got more interested on the business side of things. Did an MBA, started getting me wondering, hey, it doesn't seem like mining company performance is what it could be. Hey, like there's a lot of stigma around the industry of, low performance, low returns.
Yes.
So coming out of my MBA, really enjoying my courses in strategy and economics and thinking about how these things relate to the minerals industry, which, I came to find, I suspected and came to find is not a very studied or analyzed industry from an academic standpoint. Like why is it the way that it is? Things like, started asking questions about things like industry structure. Why do certain mining companies perform certain activities and others outsource the exact same activities? There's a really interesting bit of research done in Finland on mining company core competencies. What did mining companies see as their core competencies? And there was no rhyme or reason whatsoever. Like answers all over the place, no consistency whatsoever.
Right.
So I started, saying, like, is there an opportunity here for improved performance in the industry by taking a harder look at this stuff? So I came out of my MBA and thought, well, I've got this time carved out that I've been devoting to, and I was doing this while I was working. It was an executive MBA program, and just like, well, I could, sit on the couch, or I could try to keep this time carved out and do something else productive with it.
Yeah.
So I rolled into a PhD so the MBA was at Simon Fraser University, which is another university in Vancouver, and then went back to UBC to pursue a PhD, basically combining my experience in mining with things coming out of the MBA, trying to interrogate why, is mining company performance structurally poor? Because that was an assumption I had, but not necessarily vindicated analytically. So is that the case? And then if it is poor, why? And then what can companies do about it to improve their performance? What do the top performing companies do? What do the bottom performing companies do? What are the differences? And what can be learned by taking a really hard-nosed analytical approach to factors affecting mining company performance?
Yeah.
Coincidentally, like at the same time, an opportunity came along from a couple of university professors, one of whom I knew from work in mining innovation, around an idea for a hydrogen technology company startup. So this is like a complete career tangent. But for a couple of years, did the venture-backed startup thing in the hydrogen space. When that ran its course, I went back to thinking about all the things I'd been thinking about before around performance, mining company performance improvement, innovation in the mining industry, improving operations and mining company performance. And that led me to Red Team, who was focused on improvements through capital project performance, which is a critical element of mining company performance and the economics
Capital
around
project
mining
performance.
projects.
Okay, just what does that mean?
Proper planning, forecasting, and execution of capital projects in the mining industry. And each of those is a very important block and element in project performance. So basically, planning to do something and then doing what you plan to do. Spending the amount of money, spending the amount of time, spending the amount of resources, and then ultimately getting the benefits that you expect. But there are two sides to that. And one is having reasonable and appropriate expectations. And then the other is executing to those.
Yeah. That's really fascinating to me because I'm just reading a book. It's called Why Your Baby is Ugly, and I just was given the book and I was recommended it, and it's about businesses trying to exit, right, and business owners obviously falling in love with their project and with their baby, and not really understanding the deficiencies that you have as a company and as a project. And I think it's typical for particularly geologists, and I'm one to fall in love with their projects, technically speaking, and then kind of run it and plan it completely incorrectly based on the wrong expectations. So, and there's a big emphasis on the book from a business management perspective. So kind of an overlap of what you're talking about here to the planning, right? If you don't plan, then everything falls into a heap. And I guess you can extend that to a mining company where you make your plans, your resource models, your reserve models, and you mine to them. And the feedback loop, the reconciliation loop of that is a well understood sort of deficiency, even in the largest companies, because there's so much data and there's so many variables. And you get sort of stuck in analysis paralysis. And you kind of run on a day-by-day basis based on some sort of status quo operational thing rather than a long-term plan, because as we well know, gold goes up to 3,400 and everybody will be on the phone to see what we can open up tomorrow to get that sort of medium grade that we thought was marginally economic a few weeks ago. So this is a long way to get to a simple point. Is that even possible in our industry? Don't you get completely sucked in as a company, whether you want it or not, whether you have your board of experienced people who've seen this movie a million times before? Is it actually possible to not get sucked into the opportunity grabbing philosophy that your shareholders will have you jump to on a minute-to-minute basis?
The classic answer is it depends.
Sure.
So there are ways. Let me talk perhaps a bit more optimistically about the ways that you can do that, and specifically because there's a lot of literature around mega projects, global mega projects, mega project forecasting. We're talking about large infrastructure projects. We're talking
1%,
about,
right? It's 1% ends up being on time and on budget. I think is that how big things get done, or something. That book that
it's around there. Yeah. It's abysmal. Like the performance is abysmal, and it's the same things that affect mining projects as affect these other. I mean, by almost all dimensions, a mining project is a mega project.
Yes,
billions of dollars.
Absolutely.
Incredible amount of risk, incredible amount of commitment for uncertain benefit in the future. So to some extent, I mean, this is a massive challenge, is that the economics get baked in at the start of the mine life. Capital cost, metal price forecast, as you mentioned, there's a massive difference in starting a mine at $3,400 gold, assuming gold's going to be $3,400 for the next 40 years, and starting at $3,400 gold and assuming the gold price could be as low as 1,800 or 2,000 or something less, and having the project decision accept and account for that uncertainty versus a company, a board of directors, supportive shareholders saying, not only is it going to be 3,400 this year, it's going to be 5,000 in 10 years. So, let's roll the dice. And the way to account for that is, and if you're familiar with the book, How to Get Big Things Done, or How Big Things Get Done, it's reference class forecasting.
Yep.
It's taking a cohort of similar projects, looking at the forecasts, looking at the outcomes, and using that as your frame of analysis, which is referred to by Kahneman and Tversky as the outside view of the project rather than the inside view. It's very easy to get caught in the details and uniqueness, and like you said, making your project your baby.
Yeah,
my baby is absolutely unique. There's no other baby like mine in the world, and here are all the things that make it special, and here are all the reasons that nothing is going to ever go wrong with my baby of a project. Unfortunately, that's what every single other person thought about their project too. Yeah. And they still had the average outcomes or some distribution centered on that average, which, in mining is in the order of 30 to 40% cost overruns on capital on the capital side.
Yes.
And frankly, that's not even accounting for the change in, I say generically use the term benefits, but production times metal price at the other end of it as well, because to the point you made earlier, it's not when prices are historically low that mines get started. It's when prices are historically high and have been rising. And we all know that metal prices are cyclical. So much more likely than not, there will be an impending price decline in the next 3, 5, 10 years after the start of that mining operation. And these are things that can get analyzed and accounted for by building a reference class of similar projects and looking at what the outcomes and the performance was of those projects, and then applying those, uplift factors or schedule delays or what have you to the project that you have at hand to give you a more objective outside view of it.
Yeah, I find that fascinating because I do, I probably am more in that proper planning state of mind than I am in the entrepreneurial, let's just throw some shit on the wall and see what happens. But I do have time for the argument that, I don't know, I'm just pulling a number out of my ass here, but half of the mines of today wouldn't have been built if people would have planned it meticulously. At some point you need somebody to say, let's go. And I can point to a few mines here in this country that if you would have over-engineered everything, it would have never gotten off the ground. And particularly with the uncertainties that sit in the technical space around the early resource stage, there is an argument to say that the entrepreneurs who have not over-analyzed everything, probably who suffer from a wee bit of Dunning-Kruger have just gone on the road and started driving. And Kalman and Klein, I think, is an article or a paper that, or one of his co-authors that talk about the psychology of this, which I find quite interesting. And I'm always wondering, of course, in hindsight, all these projects, and there's plenty of failures. But as a society, we do get stuff on the road by entrepreneurs just going out and doing stuff. I mean, I'm not sure if I'm explaining that well, but
no, you are. And I mean, I'm in that bucket too. I ran a venture-backed startup, which is just an insane thing to do, like an absolutely insane,
fun,
and I would say wildly inadvisable thing to do.
Yes, indeed,
for most people. But I'm in that bucket too, so I can absolutely feel that argument. I think there are two dimensions, right? Or not two dimensions, but there's two situations in what you described. One is should never have gotten started and ended up being an economically bad decision for everybody who financed that project.
Yes.
And I mean, in that case, that no, it should not have gotten started.
Objectively, right? Yes.
Objectively, right? But there's a very different scenario where if you look at the analysis with, let's just say, conservative assumptions, it should not have gotten started at the time. Somebody took an inordinate amount of risk to sanction the project and start building the mine and put it into operation. But it ended up being wildly successful afterwards. Perhaps it started with a 15-year mine life with marginal economics, and it's still operating 80 years hence, producing good value, right? I think that these are things that also need to be baked into the analysis and understood. And what this comes from is accepting and living with the uncertainty of mining projects. And by that, I mean, it may be the case that you can have an operation. And frankly, based on my PhD research, where I looked at, over 100 companies, over 300 projects, looking through what happened, from the start of operation through the life of those mines.
Yes.
And you can, in a similar way, to say, okay, I'm going to build a reference class and say that, I want to start a mine, and of similar projects, half of them went 50% over budget. So I need to take that that risk into account. But on the other hand, 80% of them increased reserves by more than 40% over the next 5 to 10 years of operation. And that is a real outside view that is a legitimate part of the economics of building and operating a mine that you will not see if you never start it. Yes. So I think these are, but what one has to do is accept the inherent uncertainty, not reduce it to a single point guess or pretend it doesn't exist or pretend that we can predict metal prices every single year for the next 20 years. We can predict accurately what the grade is when we haven't drilled the extent and the depth of this ore body. It's sitting there and saying, we don't know, and here's the range of possibilities. And we can have a more informed idea of what the probability of these things are by looking at past projects and looking at what other people's experiences were. And balance of probability, we're going to take the chance on this mine and this mine and this mine. And with a portfolio approach, we expect that some real percentage of these is going to go ahead and achieve the benefits that are beyond what we necessarily expected in our baseline. And in that way can generate real value in a uncertain environment.
So there must be a significant people component to that equation, right? Because, and this has always fascinated me, because in your analysis, I'm sure you looked at board compositions and experience and track records and all those things. And it's extremely complex. And if you put a board together, there will be some people who you need there who will have some of that, this is a risk that we want to take. And you will need to have some people who've seen that movie before and know all those projects and the reference, framework that we're working under. And you need some people who understand that you might be the small group of people that make the decision, but then you need the operators to make that work. And that you can look at a lot of projects, and I don't have the data, so I'm basically saying this from absolutely no position of knowledge at all, but probably intuition and some interaction with the industry. There are some operators that run these mines or these projects, and they're just so freaking good at what they do. And employing them, and that's another point that I picked up in another book the other day, your ability to pick the right people for that job, to me, that's a fork in the road, right? You can make these shit projects work with good people, but the other way around, you can have some pretty decent projects completely fall to pieces by having what starts with the wrong board who don't put the right people on the job. So maybe it's a roundabout way to get to the point, but to what degree have you looked into the people aspects without doing like disc reviews or whatever you want to call them, to see, or the Myers-Briggs kind of analysis of what kind of person you want in that job. So there must be a huge component to that.
Somewhere that there has been some work done around that I do think speaks directly to the point you're making around there's a level where people need to be making coherent decisions in an uncertain environment, and that takes a certain type of person. And that is absolutely, I believe, what you need at the board and the senior executive level. You need people who can accept risk, understand what to do in the face of risk, and we can get into some discussions around, development of real options and how do you deal with really fundamental uncertainty at the company level, and how can you manage that? However, like once a strategic decision has been made, hey, we're going to build this mine, you need people who can execute. You don't want people, at the mine general manager level who are going to do a bunch of navel gazing and what ifing and this, that, whatever. It's people who see the plan, can make the plan and work the plan. Hey, this is the direction we've decided to go, and this is what we're going to focus on doing, and we're going to ruthlessly execute that. I think that they're probably, I haven't seen anything yet that is some sort of, you mentioned DISC and Myers-Briggs, something that can necessarily tease out those particular personality traits of, conceptualizing, managing risk, option development versus squashing risk. How do we take the risk that we can manage and just reduce it to zero so that we can execute successfully?
I think so. As you were saying that, so I read you referenced Kahneman a few minutes ago, and one of the papers. Now this is too long ago now, but so I'm probably paraphrasing this right. But I think they talk about, and I think the co-author was Klein or Kine. I can't remember now, but I think they talk about the difficulty for experts with an extremely small framework of reference how many projects could you possibly have been expected, or could you possibly expect it to have completed to give you a full range of the spectrum, right? You have completed one project, and through various variables that just worked out, you've made that work, and now you are the expert based on that one experience point. But you don't have that expertise, but everybody points at you, said, hey, you're the experienced person, and suddenly, and then the psychological sort of shift comes where you think you're the man, and you're not, right? You've just been lucky, effectively. And I found that, and I was sent this by a PhD student as well, who had some overlap with what you're talking about here, and who will try and get on the channel as well. But as a resource geologist, I'm sure you know what we do, what magic we do. That really applies, right? Because we've done 3 resources and we think, okay, I know how this game works, but to build that spectrum is it's just impossible. And there's analogies to other industries, I think, that come to mind here as well. So, yeah, I mean, this is not to go against anything you've said there, but I think I've always been fascinated by that people component. We understand from the analysis that you've done, for instance, as well, that, it's these 30% of projects or 1% of projects never get finished on time and on budget. But it's also just very hard to do. And you talk about uncertainty. I wouldn't know 20 people, and having a pretty reasonable cross-cut across the industry that, of people that I try to talk to, who would have that pedigree and that experience that to where you say, okay, if I look at them running 10 projects, all 10 would be delivered on time and on budget. In other words, are our expectations fair at any time around this? I find it just incredibly complex.
No, I don't think they are, and I don't think our expectations of ourselves in these situations are reasonable either. One of my favorite examples of this is from Daniel Kahneman, who is literally the world expert on broadly optimism bias.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And there's a whole bunch of things that come into this optimism bias that result in you thinking things are going to go quicker or better than they do relentlessly, anchoring to pre-existing experience. So to your point, if you have somebody who ran a very successful project, they're going to be anchored to that experience, and they're going to go into the next project thinking, I am the person who runs absolutely excellent projects, as opposed to, well, probably a more appropriate adjective would be, there's probably going to be regression to the mean, and this next project is probably going to be a lot more difficult. But no one ever thinks that. It is wildly difficult psychologically. And Kahneman brings up an example where he was involved in the writing of a textbook. Him and a few other professors were deciding to write a textbook. And there was one person in the group who had experience writing a textbook or was familiar with a few textbooks that had been written, and they asked him, hey, like, what's the average time it takes to write a textbook? He said, well, usually about 7 years, and maybe half of them don't get finished. But they said, no, that's not going to happen to us. There's no way. We'll get this done in 2 years, no problem.
Great.
And ultimately ended up taking them 8 years.
Yeah, right.
So
right.
if the world leading expert cannot walk himself back from the ledge of optimism bias, the rest of us really just don't stand a chance. So that's not to be demoralizing, but what it is pointing to is absolutely the need to gut check against the average for a population of similar tasks or projects.
So as a consultant, right, in what you do, I presume you work with boards, companies to help people with this, right? Because this is so.
Yeah.
business consultant, management, whatever term that should be. Do you? I mean, people are receptive to this idea, and anybody with some experience in the industry, in some management role, would go, "Yeah, I know this. This is people have heard of this, so they're aware of it." I don't think you'd meet many people who said, "No, I don't believe in that stuff. Hold my beer. I'll sort this out." So people are surely receptive to what you're saying, but that's still not enough to actually then get what does success look like, right? I mean, maybe you can. What's your personal experience with this? Yeah,
it's a great framing is what does success look like?
Yeah,
because success doesn't look like a demoralizing analysis that this project is likely to go.
Yeah. Here's the bill for my consulting work. You're gonna fail. But that's not gonna make you any friends, right?
It's gonna be terrible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Where this does get productive is when it comes to identifying and managing the risks that are most likely to come to pass, and being able to quantitatively account for the things that you can't foresee. Like,
right.
Everybody sees the utility in building a risk register. Everybody sees the utility in understanding what the inherent risk is at a project level. And so what this methodology is offering in the next layer of detail is these are the things that are most likely to specifically go wrong, and the large magnitude risks that others have foreseen or that others have not foreseen but experienced. And then what do we do to plan for these things? What do we do to work on these things? And that is where innovation starts to dovetail into this work. It's how do we do things differently in a way to either reduce the risk that we're seeing or increase the potential upside and opportunity by doing something in a different way. And
but
that is the dovetail of this.
No, I get that. And this is great because this is a great segue to innovation, because devil's advocate would say, yes, but we all know in mining, and I saw a post just the other day that was quite on point. It was, and I forget the phrasing now, but it was that we're paralyzed by scope of concept, proof of concept, analysis, and we never want to lock in any new innovation because we need to do more testing, and nobody can ever put their signature on a piece of paper. And I've got direct experience with some of those implementations where you just watch a new technique that's clearly working. I'll just use inverted commas here because, what does that mean? But the adaptation by the industry is so incredibly slow because probably that sensitivity to risk, because you're doing something different. And with an engineering background, if I come to a mining company with a new resource model, the engineers are you can see them, the veins in their neck starting to throb if you've made a change to your conditions in your resource model, right? Because anything new or different means another variable that could throw us outside of our orbit here. So, but you're saying innovation could actually be the solution to this, which is a little bit counterintuitive to me. So,
I think there's two important elements there. I think one is that, and I mean, this is coming from firsthand experience. I think that one of the challenges in innovation in mining is that often, and I have absolutely been guilty of this, like right in the bullseye of this problem, is working really hard on really great innovations that just don't matter.
Right.
That in the greater scheme of things just are not going to move the needle. And, for example, this is one of the things that I walked into, a notion I walked into to my PhD work with was around the vertical integration and structure of the mining industry, and just observing that, if you have a mining company running their own drill and blast operation and they get a 10% drill and blast improvement, that is not even going to come remotely close to a rounding error on their financial statement. So any work dedicated to that inside their own organization is probably doomed for failure because it's not worth the risk. On the other hand, if you have a drill and blast contractor who's operating at 50 sites and they have a 10% improvement in their technology or processes or costs or whatever, that's ultimately 10% on their bottom line immediately. So there is a massive incentive for them to do it. So I think that when it comes to companies, let's just say operating mining companies, there needs to be a really strong focus on what actually matters for that operation, for that organization to really move the needle, because it is very difficult to do anything in a mining operation that doesn't involve some sort of risk, production disruption, unintended consequences, whatever. And in order to have that adopted, there needs to be the buy-in of, this is valuable enough that we are willing to take the risk associated with making a change. So I think that's the first one.
Can I maybe just ask, because that kind of makes sense, but again, playing devil's advocate, there must be a number of small incremental improvements that just make people's lives more streamlined. And as I like to think, when I talk about different ways of doing it in the data sort of geological space that I operate in, probably doesn't make a whole heap of difference. But the cultural shift that it brings along is quite interesting to me, because if people care about the way you do things, the worst thing that can happen is that you all run your operation more efficiently. There's better care about the data. There's better care of how it's been used. And if you're, like even something stupidly small like how you log your core as a geologist, clearly it's not making a bottom line change. You won't see that on the balance sheet, on the P&L at the end of it, fine. But it is all these incremental changes to just doing things in a better way. Is there an argument for, and they're probably low cost innovations anyway, right? It doesn't have to be the thing that flies us to Mars tomorrow.
I think the answer to that is yes, and I think the frame that I would take is, so what I was just, I want to make a tangent comment right after this. So like give you some space to do that.
Go for it. Yeah, plenty of time.
But what I was mentioning earlier was at the mining company level, buy-in from the top down. We're going to make a major change. We're going to do something differently. When we're just talking, again, my personal experience around selling innovation, I think that the reality of it needing to matter enough is still correct. It's just at what level and to whom. If you've got the person who's in charge of all the core logging at a drill program, and they've got kilometers of drill core to log in front of them, and that is the person that, let's say somebody has the core logging innovation that they're talking to about, hey, this is going to make your life better, that should be received well. Like if that's the place where the innovation is getting sold, if that's getting sold to their boss's boss, good luck. Good luck getting the attention, right? So I think that just when it comes to selling innovation, getting innovation adopted, it is finding the right point of contact to have that warmly received. The tangent I want to go on is just picking up something you said a few moments ago, which was, working on the resource, working on the reserve estimate, like, is that really going to make a difference? Like my PhD research uncovered that the largest cause of shareholder value destruction is asset impairments.
Yes.
And when an asset impairment is declared being attributed to ore grade problems, on average, 45% of the asset value is impaired and written off. So like the mine loses half its value when that happens. So I think there's also an element of, framing the problem, because from my point of view, even a very minor improvement to an extremely large problem is very valuable.
Yeah. That's a really interesting tangent, and I could tangent on your tangent for another couple of hours, because this is one of my favorite topics. Indeed, the mystery around the resource estimation process and the impact that has on the planning, right? Because I always describe it as a key nexus of a whole bunch of things that from which then a whole bunch of other forks in a road eventuate. This is the point where you put value on the project, where you start talking to people. And as we well know, like any project, you build these models with the best intentions. They're all models, they're all wrong, etc. And there has been a discussion for decades now how we can improve that, and we're still using techniques that are 60 years old and so on. And for that reason, we have a conference on this stuff coming up, right? So just to talk about these exact kind of questions. So I'm fully on board with that argument. But innovation there is very much needed, and is a topic that we'll be discussing at the conference, right? I mean, what does innovation look like there? Really, really interesting. But if you want to jump in there, go for it. But
yeah, I do, because I think there's one other dimension on the topic of innovation that people often, I don't know, not gloss over, but perhaps don't appreciate fully. I think that innovation is very often seen as technology adoption. We have this current widget that we're using. Widget could be physically instantiated, it could be software, it could be whatever, and we're going to replace it with a better widget that someone's developed.
Right.
I'm a very strong proponent of a much bigger tent definition of innovation. Business model innovation, process innovation, commercial innovation. Simply by innovation, I just mean adopting a new idea or way of doing things in an organization. And that could be, hey, we're going to take this aspect of our business and we're going to outsource it to somebody we think can do better. Hey, we're going to take this way that we've contracted in the past with this particular service provider, and we're going to change that around in a different way. We're going to rearrange this process we're currently following to do that differently. Like, for me, all of these things fall into the category of innovation. And to your point about risk, generally technology switch out can be like a widget switch out, can be a risky endeavor because you're not really sure what may happen. Whereas there, I think, is a huge amount of opportunity for business model, commercial, process innovation that has the opportunity for just as strong value, but at potentially much lower risk and much more easily reversible in a lot of cases if things don't go the way that you want them to.
Yeah, would that be a strong argument to just put some variety to your boards, right? I mean, you want somebody on there who thinks, and I dare to use the outside the box phrasing, but I would almost say somebody from a different generation that has, maybe played too much COD in their life, but who comes up with some wild boar ideas to just throw in the mix there of innovations, right? And rather than a very conventional, this is how we've always done it. And I can think of a few of my clients who have probably more innovation drive than I've seen in a long time. And I see people involved with that who are, who don't have 5 decades of governance experience. And actually it's quite refreshing to see, and they're far more bullish into this innovation space. And I've picked up on that, and I think there should be more companies doing that. Is that maybe a strategy to achieve that? Do you bring that into your analysis and your advice as you're working with clients?
I mean, there has been empirical work done that typically a stronger diversity of opinion at the executive or board level, as long as that diversity is preserved, produces better results. So, it doesn't help a lot to start with a bunch of diversity and have everyone converge on the same opinion and walk out of the room. But being able to maintain, start with diverse opinions and then maintain those and make decisions with, and again, it's a bit of a, it sounded like a bit of a broken record on the embracing uncertainty topic, but that's an element of it, is being able to accept and maintain diverse opinions that say, hey, maybe the 5 different people thinking the right thing to do could be 5 different things, but finding ways to manage that uncertainty and manage that reality, and they're very, I don't want this to sound too airy-fairy. I mean, I'm much more of an action person than an ideas person. I don't I think there's a Peter Drucker quote that I really like, which is something like, I'm going to butcher this, but something like, ideas are worthless unless they rapidly degrade into hard work. Okay. I very much, much feel similarly to that. But I think that's nice. What what to do about maintaining that diversity of opinion is pursuing strategic options. Spending real organizational resources, developing and keeping options open to manage the different ways that the future may unfold.
And is that what you do then if you work with groups? Is that what you look at, and is that what's in, and do you have the balls to say to a chair of a board that, look, sorry man, but I've been part of these interactions for a few months now and you just don't have diversity of thought here at all? I mean, maybe on paper you do. I mean, that's not a very nice thing to put in a
well, feedback. Again, it's the focus on what's the useful thing we can do with this. And the useful thing we can do is saying, here's the diversity of opinion. If the future unfolds in this way, this is what we would want to do. If the future unfolds in this other way, this is some other thing that we would want to do. How can we expend resources and create a plan that creates and preserves real optionality in the business in both of these directions? Tangibly. What would we do with this operation if the price of gold was $5,000 an ounce? And what would we do with this operation if it was $2,000 an ounce? Yeah. And can we spend 5% of the project value to keep profitable options open in both of those scenarios? Yeah. And that is a productive decision to have that embraces uncertainty, preserves a diversity of opinion, and actually has a strategic action associated with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, nice.
So it's not necessarily having to say everything is going wrong and everything needs to
poking
change.
The bear here a little bit. That's I'm trying to imagine structuring your advice as a consultant. I'm always working out how to best deliver. Ultimately, you're there to make change, right? So people have to be prepared for change. It's one of my favorite quotes: "Who wants change? Everybody. Who wants to change? Nobody." Right? I mean, it is.
Yes.
So you have to sometimes break an egg to make an omelet, etc. So I'm always interested to hear other people's experience, how they deliver these kind of fairly heavy, high-level structural changes that might need to happen, or in decision making and so on. But look, maybe changing tack a little bit, innovation, right? So a couple of things that I wanted to ask you. Maybe first, is there actually, because I'm getting sick and tired of people saying on an almost daily basis, through the social media outlets that we all know, that there is not enough innovation in the mining industry. Where do you sit? Do we have enough? Is there not enough? How would you describe it? Or is it just a wrong question to begin with?
I think to some extent it's the wrong question, because and perhaps this is reaching back to the point I was making around doing things and focusing on things that matter. There's no, from my point of view, no real sense in innovation just for innovation's sake. Like, let's do things differently just to do things differently. Okay, well, why? And I'm going to sound a little bit antiquated, perhaps, when I say this, but my feelings evolving a little bit on this. I'm certainly one who's willing to change my mind as new information comes in. But historically, that's how I felt about big data.
Okay,
or at least not about big data, but about people's attitudes towards big data.
Right.
Imagine all the things that we could do with all of this data. Well, no, I don't want to imagine. Tell me what we could do with it. Tell me specifically what we were going to do and what problems we were going to solve with this data. I don't want to have to imagine.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of innovation can go in a similar way, where we need to be innovating. Where and why, and for what purpose? What problem are we solving? And I think from my point of view, I do believe that there is a very structural, fundamental problem with the financial performance mining companies. So there are factors that affect that. Certainly asset impairment. So if somebody came to me and said, I want to focus on innovation to reduce the most likely causes of asset impairments in the mineral industry, yes, let's do more of that. Everyone, every day. That is if and I mean, there are different dimensions of performance for mining companies, right? Social responsibility, environmental performance, all these sorts of things, and all of those in their own right are critical and have important factors that drive those performance. But like, if just for example, we're talking about financial performance, then hey, let's dig into that and let's work on the most important factors to affect it. And I think from my point of view, if somebody was sitting with my own opinion that like, hey, or my own, let's just say this frame of reference, that's what we want to focus on. Yeah, let's dig in. And certainly we don't have enough innovation or different or doing things differently pointed in that direction.
Yeah, but ultimately people get into innovation not just because they are interested in the solution. There has to be some commercial aspect of it as well. You're not going to go through 10 years of development and to 100,000 conferences to try and tell people that people need this. Because in this industry, we know that, sometimes it pays off more to buy physical gold than it is to invest in a gold company. I mean, that's,
75% of the time,
right?
Statistically.
I mean, but if you just look at that statistics, you get quite demoralized to do anything with the mining industry, right? Just do something with tech. Although Tesla, in hindsight, might not have been your best choice, but but there is this constant, simple capitalist sort of balancing act that we're working out. You put money in, you get your investment coming out. It's on ROI that needs to make sense. And if that's not attractive, then why would you, right? And is that an element to this, that we just need to make this whole industry sexier for everybody to come into and innovate?
I think that I've got a couple things on that. I think the first is that you've identified the existential risk, is that if returns in the mining industry can't improve, it's not going to attract investment. And I think it was a few years ago, EY had that very close to the top of their list of risks facing the mining industry was returns. Investors expecting better returns. So one of the things that I would say, let's say somebody, you've got somebody who's a few years out of a engineering degree and they want to attack a startup. It was probably a much better time to do it in your early 20s than in your late 30s. But if they want to do that, my advice would be find big problems to focus on. Find big problems that, if you want to do it in the mining industry, find big problems that the mining industry or prospective customers feel as big problems, and focus on those. And I think that's from my point of view, the thing that can keep everybody excited, because you're right. People go into the innovation space because they do want to make change. They do want to do exciting things. They do want to make a positive difference. And I would offer that life is going to be a lot easier figuring out what the biggest problems people need to solve are and then going and attacking those. Because I think there's lots of room for that. That's another dimension of innovation that I think that's underexplored in mining is, there's a landscape of options for how to do, we talked about kind of the what of innovation, but how to do innovation between entrepreneurship, and you've got Oz Minerals going to BHP and their Think and Act Differently group, really strong entrepreneurial spirit there. Right. Also reaching out in the entrepreneurial space, making connections in the industry more broadly, right? Yeah. Joint ventures, startups, funding in unique ways. I mean, I think that having, my venture-backed startup experience, I do believe for industrial organizations like mining companies, there's a much more efficient strategy for startup and company in the investment model that's pursued. Right. When you just look at the value that some of these innovations and technology development and process innovation can have on the company, that is just orders and orders and orders of magnitude more than, like an equity investment in a startup, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a lot of room to grow when it comes to the nature of collaboration and the structure of innovation, internal and external, and in some cases blurring those organizational boundaries to pursue really important innovation.
Do you see that, and I talked about this a couple of years ago, I can't remember with who on the channel now, but you just said the word that was quite hot for a while there, the collaboration. And I think I can see more collaboration between, not just between mining companies who used to be very close to their chest with data and information, but also with how their teams interact. And in the innovation space, in other industries, you have innovation networks where people can kind of learn, particularly the younger entrepreneurs. There are small networks in cities based, with hubs where people come together and so on. But is there room for something specific in a mining industry that just puts that, I don't want to say all under one hood, but is there maybe a call for an innovation space where we can all sort of sit and share those ideas for the greater good? Or am I sounding too much like a hippie now?
No. It's the right question to ask. I think that's a super important question to ask, and I think it's a can of worms, because it depends on how companies see their competitive position.
Right.
Because for example, if you have, which is often the case in mining, I think one of the reasons that there is pressure on mining company returns and financial performance is that there is a very present fast follower mentality.
Sure.
Somebody goes through the pain of adopting something, and then, contrary to the normal experience, like if 2, 3, 4 of your competitors adopt it, like everybody else rushes to do the same thing. And then in that case, everybody's lowered their cost position equally, and the value accrues to the customers.
Of course, it's a race, right? So, and I'm not saying that you want to bring the 4 groups who are developing the same kind of solution in a room and say, hey, what are you working on? But for instance, there's a guy who runs a junior company in Perth, and he's created this CEO network group where there's a whole bunch of juniors who are effectively all competing for the same investment dollar, right? And they are all having the same tenements, and they're not working on technology or anything, but there is an argument to say that you keep your cards close to your chest, but to have people in the room and sharing, sort of feedback on, hey, what's happening, what problems are you facing? I could certainly see how a company developing core scanning technology could learn a bit about the market from the folks who have been developing photon assaying for the last 10 years, right? Because they would have had a couple of oh shit moments, like didn't realize that was going to be so hard, or something like that. Or well, how do you see your ideas landing at your potential clients? That could be without having to share the IP on the PowerPoint slide. But
I don't want to create the sense that I think that collaboration for innovation is a bad idea. I do think it is well suited to situations like you're describing. I mean, there's a very strong argument to be made that the core IP for each mining company is their reserve base.
Of course.
Like you have a high quality reserve or a medium quality reserve or a low quality reserve, and that's going to be your competitive advantage. And it doesn't really matter kind of what happens along the periphery. Really what we're trying to do there is, improve safety performance, improve environmental performance, and to some extent improve cost performance to keep everybody in operation and keep everybody's, employed and home safe every day, which are, I think, extremely important goals. Yeah. And I think that, in those dimensions, there probably is a really strong opportunity for collaboration, and especially in environments that can bring in potential startups, potential vendors, potential, people outside the organizational boundary who can sit at or adjacent to the table and say, like, oh, I see that everybody else has, like, everyone around this table has this particular problem. And, I've got a really good idea for addressing that. And here's an existing customer base, right? I think that absolutely that's appropriate for large swaths of industrial innovation.
Yeah. Now, look, I mean, that's and maybe as a one last question, and see what else is on your mind. But should countries do more in innovation? Because that particularly in the mining space, I mean, rather than just let the companies go their merry way. Because I have talked to somebody a couple of years ago now that was saying, look, Australia used to do so much innovation, but right now the R&D budget is X% of what it used to be, and it's all gone overseas. How do you see that balance?
Oh, that is a good question. Empirically, I like I like empirical evidence. Some of the world's largest mining services companies were originally government-backed entities. And there's no denying that history. Yeah. So I think that they're probably, I come from a area and say, like, I'm not going to say anti-government, but like small government area of Canada, go from the far west side, as far as you can possibly get from the central government. There's a really strong entrepreneurial, we're on the other side of this big mountain range. We can do everything ourselves. So it's not my natural inclination to say government's the answer to anything. But, as I think, gotten older and perhaps, collected some more balanced opinions, I do think there is a strong role to be played for supporting fundamental research at universities and for assisting and supporting the growth of industries adjacent to that. And if for no other reason, then it's a competitive environment, and other countries are absolutely doing that. and
Yes.
doing that very aggressively.
Yes.
So, if governments like Canadian, Australian, New Zealand government aren't doing that,
Yeah.
absolutely those innovations will flow elsewhere, and be supported and germinate and grow elsewhere, because other countries and other governments are absolutely doing that.
Yeah. No, fair comments. Good stuff, man. Well, anything else on your mind? I mean, it's we've sort of gone well over the usual hour, so that means it's a fun conversation, and it's a topic that I really enjoy. But anything else on your mind?
I mean, always lots of things, but I think we covered a lot of good ground, and always happy to come back and extend the conversation, if and when it makes sense.
Yeah,
I'm always noodling on things. So you'll often see, as I think you caught, you'll see my periodic posts on LinkedIn and elsewhere, just with general thoughts about the industry. So it's
I do enjoy.
If anyone's listening or watching, feel free to connect or follow with me on LinkedIn to get things on articles and posts and thoughts on all the topics we've discussed.
Yeah, no, that's definitely.
And frankly, I'd be remiss not to give a very direct plug to Red Team projects. So if anyone is keyed into any of the topics we've mentioned or strategies for dealing with uncertainty and capital project performance, it's redteamprojects.com is the company website, and also connect with me on LinkedIn. You can reach out through there.
I'll put a link in the description, and maybe as you said that, it might actually be interested at some point to do a group conversation with a few other people that I know are very active in this space, because Joel is just asking question. I'm not actually innovating anything. So I just, it's just an interesting space. But I might come back to you on this, because I know some people who've got lots of good ideas here, and you might get some more interesting challenges there. So that might be something for the future. But really appreciate you making the time. I'll put those links in the descriptions, and anyone listening, please connect with you. And thanks for coming on the show, man. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Sounds great. Anytime.
All right. Catch you later, man. See ya.